Division retreating. Contact lost. Enemy armored vehicles in the rear. We request authorization for withdrawal. These messages were repeated endlessly. But there was a huge problem. The authorization almost never came. In Berlin, Adolf Hitler continued to believe that the situation could still be stabilized. As on so many other occasions during the war, he refused any significant retreat. In his view, abandoning ground meant admitting defeat. Every position should be held to the last man, regardless of the tactical situation. It was an order that seemed firm on paper. In the reality of the battlefield, it became almost impossible to fulfill. Several local commanders clearly understood that remaining where they were meant only allowing their troops to be surrounded. They watched Soviet tanks advancing along the flanks, cutting roads and occupying key intersections. Military logic dictated retreating immediately. Hitler's orders said exactly the opposite. This conflict between reality and higher orders was beginning to produce devastating consequences. While some commanders strictly obeyed the orders they received, others initiated small retreats on their own, trying to save what remained of their units. This created new gaps between the defensive sectors. The greater the German disorganization, the more easily the Soviets found new ways to penetrate the rear. It was like watching a dam begin to crack. Initially, only small cracks appear. Then new leaks appear. Then the entire structure begins to collapse all at once. That's exactly what happened along the front. The first breaches in the summer of 1944, the war in Eastern Europe had reached a point where every decision could change the fate of millions. For 3 years, the Wehrmacht had advanced deep into Soviet territory, conquering cities, villages, and vast stretches of land. But that army, which had once seemed invincible, was no longer the same. Defeats at Stalingrad, Kursk, and in countless smaller battles had consumed experienced soldiers, tanks, trucks, and aircraft at a rate that German industry could no longer fully replenish. Still, many officers believed that if they could stabilize the front line, Germany could prolong the war and perhaps find a political way out. It was then, in June 1944, that the Red Army launched an offensive that would completely change the balance of power on the Eastern Front. Operation Bagration fell upon Army Group Center like an unstoppable avalanche. Within weeks, entire divisions disappeared from the map. Cities considered fortresses were taken one after another. Retreating German columns filled the roads while thousands of destroyed vehicles lay abandoned, slowly burning under the summer sky. What had once been a continuous line of defense was transformed into enormous gaps, through which Soviet tanks advanced almost without resistance. The news coming from Belarus was increasingly terrifying. Trains loaded with wounded soldiers crisscrossed the rear day and night. Makeshift military hospitals were overflowing. Many survivors arrived in a state of shock, covered in dust, dried blood and mud, unable to clearly describe what they had seen. Some spoke of bombings so intense that the ground seemed to tremble incessantly for hours. Others recounted how entire units had simply ceased to exist after being surrounded by vastly superior Soviet forces. Even in the face of that monumental disaster, Adolf Hitler refused to accept that the situation was spiraling out of control. In Berlin, he remained convinced that the worst was over. In his view, the destruction of Army Group Center was serious, but localized. He believed that Western Ukraine remained relatively safe, thanks to the strong defensive positions built around Lviv and Brody. In Hitler's mind, that region functioned as a huge shield protecting the path to Poland, and consequently, to the very heart of the Reich. This confidence didn't stem solely from political convictions. The geography seemed to favor the Germans. The region possessed rivers, gentle hills, forested areas, and defensive lines prepared months in advance. Heavy projectiles began to rain down on the defensive positions like a storm of steel. Trenches carefully constructed over it could never be closed. Every meter gained had to be immediately exploited with new troops, new armored vehicles, and more artillery. While the Germans were trying to reorganize a defensive line, another breach was already appearing a few kilometers ahead. The speed of the Soviet advance was impressive. The T-34 tanks traversed roads, wheat fields, and small villages almost without slowing down. Trucks loaded with motorized infantry followed close behind. Whenever they encountered stronger resistance, all they had to do was call in the artillery or request air support. Within minutes, the German positions were once again orders were transmitted by messengers instead of radio whenever possible, reducing the chances of interception by German intelligence services. This gigantic effort was part of the sophisticated Soviet doctrine known as camouflage, a set of camouflage, disinformation, and operational deception techniques that had been perfected since the beginning of the war. The objective was simple: to convince the Germans that there would be no major offensive in that sector. While enormous military formations were being deployed to the Lviv region, fake troop concentrations appeared in other parts of the front. Inflatable tanks were positioned in open fields. Fake artillery pieces were constructed from wood. Radio movements simulated entire armies where there were practically no soldiers. German reconnaissance planes photographed these areas and sent reports that reinforced exactly what the high command wanted to believe. Wehrmacht intelligence services perceived some increase in Soviet activity, but concluded that it was merely defensive reinforcements or small local operations. No one imagined that, a few kilometers behind the lines, one of the largest military concentrations of the entire 1944 campaign was being formed. The numbers impressed even many Soviet officials. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers were discreetly positioned along the front. Thousands of tanks waited hidden under trees or camouflage nets. Kilometers of ammunition depots were relentlessly replenished. Railway wagons arrived laden with projectiles, fuel, food, spare parts, and medical equipment. Each Soviet offensive depended on a gigantic amount of supplies, and Konev was determined not to repeat the mistakes made in the early years of the war. When promising attacks failed due to logistical shortcomings, the artillery received special attention. Cannons of all calibers were carefully distributed along the attack line. There were light guns to accompany the infantry, heavy howitzers capable of destroying concrete fortifications, and Katyusha multiple rocket launchers, whose roar had terrified German soldiers since previous battles. Depots near the front stored millions of projectiles. The plan was to begin the offensive with such intense bombardment that many defensive positions would cease to exist even before the Soviet infantry advanced. In heaven, the situation had also changed radically compared to the early years of the war. The Luftwaffe, once the undisputed master of the skies, now suffered from a shortage of experienced pilots, fuel, and aircraft. In contrast, the Soviet Air Force had grown enormously. Hundreds of fighter and attack aircraft were prepared to accompany every stage of the offensive. Their mission would be to destroy reinforcement columns, impede armored counterattacks, attack communication centers, and maintain constant pressure on any German attempt to reorganize their lines. Meanwhile, Soviet military engineers carefully studied maps, aerial photographs, and information provided by reconnaissance patrols. Every river, every road, every bridge, and every elevation of terrain was analyzed in detail. Reconnaissance groups silently traversed no man's land at night, observing machine gun positions, identifying minefields, and marking potential weak points in German defenses. Everything was planned so that when the offensive began, the first few minutes would be decisive. Unlike the large German offensives of 1941, which often prioritized speed above all else, the Soviets now combined speed with overwhelming firepower. First would come the systematic destruction of enemy positions. Then, infantry would fight their way through weakened sectors. Next, massive armored formations would break through these gaps before the Germans could react. The objective was not merely to push the enemy back, but to encircle. Few German officers immediately realized the danger. Most still believed that those armored vehicles were merely seeking to exploit the breaches opened during the first days of the offensive. In reality, every kilometer traveled by Soviet tanks drastically reduced the chances of the troops stationed in Brody withdrawing. Within New Alaukizai, the city and its surroundings lay a powerful German formation, the 3rd Army Corps, composed of various infantry divisions, artillery units, engineers, support troops, and among them, the newly formed 14th Grenadier Division of the Waffen-SS Galicia. recruited mainly from Ukrainian volunteers. Combined, these forces numbered tens of thousands undefended. Ivan Konev did not waste this opportunity. As soon as their commanders confirmed a sufficiently wide breach, enormous armored formations were immediately launched into the German lines. Now, isolate and completely eliminate them. While this entire gigantic war machine was being assembled in silence, a dangerous illusion of normality prevailed on the German side. Reports sent to headquarters indicated Soviet movements, but nothing to suggest an offensive of extraordinary proportions. Many commanders believed that the Red Army still needed rest after Operation Barrage. Others were convinced that the fortified terrain around Brody and Lviv would be sufficient to contain any attempt at an advance. It was precisely this false sense of security that Stalin and Konev desired. Each passing day without raising suspicion meant more tanks were deployed, more ammunition was stockpiled, more soldiers arrived at the front line, and more details of the plan were refined. When everything was finally ready, there would be no warning. There wouldn't be time to rearrange reservations. There would be no opportunity to build a new defensive line. In the early morning hours chosen by the Soviet command, hundreds of thousands of men would break the silence simultaneously. The sky would be torn by the roar of thousands of cannons, and the land of western Ukraine would begin to tremble under a bombardment so violent that many German soldiers would believe they were witnessing the end of the world. The storm they thought was far away was already brewing. All that remained was the order to unleash all that force against the Wehrmacht lines. In the early morning of July 13th, 1944, the silence that had dominated the battlefront for weeks ended brutally. For a few minutes, everything seemed strangely calm. A thin mist covered the fields of western Ukraine, while the first rays of dawn began to appear on the horizon. In the German trenches, soldiers finished their guard shifts. Some prepared coffee on small improvised stoves, and others cleaned the mud from their boots before the changing of the guard. For many of them, it seemed like just another day of war. No one imagined that within a few minutes, their positions would be hit by one of the largest concentrations of artillery ever employed in that part of the Eastern Front. Long before the first shot was fired, thousands of Soviet soldiers were already silently occupying their attack positions. Gunners stood motionless beside their cannons, awaiting only a command. Officers consulted their watches. Repeatedly, forward observers, hidden on small rises or among trees, kept a close eye on the German lines. Each battery had targets carefully defined weeks in advance. Bunkers, ammunition depots, communication centers, machine gun positions, road junctions, and command posts had been precisely marked. Then the order came. In a single instant, the entire horizon seemed to explode. Thousands of cannons fired almost simultaneously. The roar was so intense that many survivors would later describe the sensation as if the earth itself was splitting in two. It wasn't just a noise. It was a shock wave that coursed through the entire body. The chest vibrated. The air felt compressed. The ground trembled continuously beneath their feet. For the first few seconds, nobody on the German lines could fully understand what was happening. Soon came the first explosions, became perfect targets. A single projectile could destroy a truck loaded with ammunition, causing secondary explosions. Rockets and ammunition trucks destroyed artillery batteries and strafed any visible concentration of troops on the roads. German reserves were beginning to suffer losses even before reaching the front lines. Meanwhile, the soldiers who remained in the trenches faced a new kind of terror. For years, the Wehrmacht had specialized in rapid attacks, using armored vehicles to break through enemy lines. Now, the Germans themselves were witnessing the same method being used against them. Whenever a T-34 tank broke through a defensive position, it did not stop to destroy each trench individually. His goal was to move forward. The tanks penetrated deep into the rear, leaving behind small groups of infantry tasked with eliminating isolated pockets of resistance. This created a sense of despair among the defenders. Many German soldiers continued fighting without realizing that they had already been overtaken. When they finally looked back, they discovered that Soviet tanks were already patrolling the roads in the rear. The supply lines were being cut. The escape routes were disappearing. Ammunition depots were beginning to fall into enemy hands. In some sectors, entire companies were completely surrounded just hours after the offensive began, without even understanding when it had happened. In the German command posts, the situation was rapidly worsening. Maps needed to be redrawn several times a day. Each new piece of information showed that the planned defensive lines simply ceased to exist. Officials were desperately trying to locate missing units. Many regiments ceased to respond altogether. No one knew if they had been destroyed, surrounded, or if they had simply lost communication. Even in the face of this increasingly serious situation, the orders coming from high command remained virtually the same. The positions should be maintained. No significant withdrawals could be authorized without higher approval. It was a decision that completely ignored the speed at which the situation was evolving. Local commanders were beginning to realize a terrifying problem. The Soviets weren't just trying to conquer territory. They were looking for loopholes. Whenever they found a weaker sector, they immediately dropped new armored vehicles into that spot, rapidly widening the breach. These openings grew from a few hundred meters to several kilometers in a matter of hours. Therefore, huge corridors formed behind the German line. Entire divisions of tanks, trucks, artillery, and motorized infantry passed through them. What initially appeared to be just a frontal attack quickly transformed into a gigantic envelopment maneuver. Konev's true intentions were finally beginning to become clear. He didn't just want to push the Wehrmacht westward. I wanted to surround her. I wanted to prevent any organized withdrawal. He wanted to turn tens of thousands of German soldiers into prisoners or corpses before they could establish a new defensive line. At the end of that first day of the offensive, many German officers still believed they could close the gaps using mobile reserves. But that hope faded with each new report. The Soviet tanks continued advancing at an impressive speed. The distances covered in just a few hours were far greater than any German commander had anticipated. In several places along the front, the offensive was no longer a simple breakthrough. It was the beginning of the collapse of the entire defensive structure of the army group, north of Ukraine. And hidden amidst that growing chaos, one specific sector was beginning to attract the attention of Soviet commanders. It was the region of Brody. There, tens of thousands of German soldiers still believed they could hold out. Little did they know that, in the following hours, they would begin walking directly into one of the biggest traps of the entire campaign. At dawn on the second day of the offensive, the reality on the front was completely different from what the German high command had imagined just a few hours earlier. What initially seemed to be a powerful Soviet attack was beginning to reveal its true nature. It was not an attempt to capture a few defensive positions or slowly push the Wehrmacht westward. The Red Army was dismantling piece by piece the entire defensive structure of Army Group North Ukraine. In several sectors along the front, the trenches simply ceased to exist. Where once there were kilometers of carefully fortified positions, now there remained smoking craters, destroyed vehicles, and hundreds of bodies scattered across the terrain. Trees had been uprooted by the explosions. Telephone cables hung unused over the mud. Anti-tank guns lay fallen beside their crews. Often killed, before they could even fire a single shot. The few units that still maintained some organization fought virtually in isolation. Entire companies no longer knew where their battalions were. Battalions had lost contact with their regiments. Regiments stopped receiving orders from their divisions. In many places, officers had to make decisions completely alone, without any communication with their superiors. This was exactly the scenario Ivan Konev intended to create. Soviet doctrine dictated that once the first breach was opened, attack aircraft, known to the Germans as flying tanks, armored and extremely resistant to anti-aircraft fire. They dove into German positions, firing cannons, machine guns, and rockets at ammunition depots, motorized columns, and troop concentrations. Vehicles would start exploding even before they could leave their parking positions. Trucks loaded with fuel turned into enormous fireballs. Ammunition depots detonated in even more violent secondary explosions, hurling projectiles and debris in all directions. On the roads behind, drivers were desperately trying to escape, but there was too much smoke, too many craters, too much wreckage. Many roads simply ceased to exist. The medical teams also quickly collapsed. Injured people kept arriving at first aid stations without stopping. Some had severe burns caused by the explosions. Others had lost arms or legs. There were men who were completely deaf due to the pressure of the impacts. Many walked around in a state of shock, covered in blood and dirt, unable to respond when someone asked their name. In various sectors, officials were trying to organize a response. But how could a defense be coordinated when virtually all communications had been destroyed? How could reinforcements be sent if the roads were blocked by potholes, fallen trees, and burning vehicles? How do you prepare a counterattack when nobody knows exactly where the enemy will attack? That was precisely the intention of the Soviet High Command. Bombing wasn't just about killing. His true objective was to completely destroy the Wehrmacht's command capabilities. Without communication, coordination, and organized reserves, even the most experienced divisions became vulnerable. For hours, the bombardment continued to batter the German positions. When the intensity finally began to decrease, an eerie silence fell over the battlefield. It was not a peaceful silence. It was the silence that follows a devastating storm. The smoke obscured almost the entire horizon. Trees were burning slowly. The trenches had disappeared. Destroyed cannons lay fallen among craters. Bodies covered in dirt and rubble began to appear as the dust settled. The German soldiers who survived were still trying to comprehend the scale of the destruction. But the worst was yet to come. The bombing was only the first, carefully planned phase of the offensive. While smoke still blanketed the battlefield, thousands of Soviet soldiers were already leaving their positions. Behind them, the engines of countless T-34 tanks began to roar. The real battle was only just beginning. When the Soviet bombardment finally began to lessen in intensity, many German soldiers believed for a brief moment that the worst was over. Some slowly emerged from the dust-covered bunkers, still stunned by the incessant roar of the artillery. Others tried to dig out comrades buried by the collapses. Doctors rushed between the craters, improvising bandages while officers shouted orders in an attempt to reorganize completely dismantled units. But that short break was part of the plan. The bombing hadn't ended because the Soviets had run out of ammunition. It had accomplished exactly its mission: to disorient, isolate, and weaken the German defenses. Now came the most dangerous phase of the entire operation. Shortly after the early hours of the morning, that only a small fraction of the tens of thousands of men surrounded managed to escape. Thousands died during the fighting. Thousands more were wounded and captured. Hundreds simply disappeared in the chaos of battle, their bodies never identified. The 13th Army Corps has virtually ceased to exist as a combat force. It was one of the biggest operational defeats suffered by the Wehrmacht in the entire 1944 campaign. While Brody was being destroyed, Ivan Konev did not interrupt his offensive for even a moment. On the contrary, Soviet forces continued advancing toward their next major objective, Lviv. With a large portion of the German reserves destroyed or surrounded in Brody, There were practically not enough troops left to organize a new solid defensive line in front of the city. The surviving divisions were continually retreating. Many arrived completely disorganized. No vehicles, no artillery, no communication, without full complement of personnel. The commanders tried to improvise new positions using whatever they still had, but it was too late. The momentum of the Soviet offensive was too strong. In the outskirts of Lviv, new violent clashes broke out. The Germans sought to defend important crossroads, railway stations, and high points that would allow them to slow the enemy advance. Houses were transformed into makeshift fortresses. Anti-tank guns were hidden among buildings. Gunmen occupied attics and towers. But the Red Army advanced, supported by an overwhelming superiority in men, armor, and artillery. Each position gained was immediately used as a base for the next attack. Little by little, the defenders were pushed out of the city. In July 27, 1944, Lvov finally fell. For Stalin, that victory had enormous political and military value. Western Ukraine was virtually liberated from German rule. The doors of Poland were beginning to open. Most importantly, the army group north of Ukraine had lost its main defensive position. The German retreat turned into a desperate race. Hundreds of vehicles were abandoned due to lack of fuel. Cannons were destroyed by their own garrisons to prevent their capture. Bridges were exploding behind the last retreating columns. Roads were completely congested with trucks, carts, horses, civilian refugees, and exhausted soldiers walking westward. During the day, these columns were constantly silhouettes began to slowly emerge through the smoke. At first, they were just small groups of Soviet infantry advancing cautiously between the craters. Soon behind them appeared more men, then dozens more, then hundreds. Within minutes, it seemed as if the earth itself was producing soldiers. The infantry divisions advanced in successive waves, maintaining constant contact with each other. Whenever they encountered a still active German position, they did not stop to engage in long battles. Specialized teams isolated it while the rest of the force continued advancing. The objective was to maintain the pace of the offensive, without wasting time on isolated points of resistance. Right behind the infantry came the true iron fist of the operation. The engines of Soviet tanks began to roar across the entire front. Hundreds of T-34 tanks advanced almost side by side, raising enormous clouds of dust mixed with smoke and dirt. For many German soldiers, that image seemed endless. Whenever one group of tanks disappeared behind a hill, another would appear immediately afterward. It was a force like few had seen throughout the entire war. The German commanders were trying to identify where the main attack was taking place. That was precisely the problem. There wasn't just one. Ivan Konev had planned an extremely broad offensive, using several Soviet armies attacking simultaneously in different sectors of the front. Instead of concentrating all their effort in a single direction, the Soviets pressed dozens of points simultaneously, forcing the Wehrmacht to divide its reserves without ever knowing where the decisive blow would come. In German headquarters, telephones were slowly returning to service as some lines were hastily repaired. The messages that were starting to arrive were extremely confusing. We are under heavy attack. Enemy armored vehicles broke through our positions. We need reinforcements immediately. We lost contact with the neighboring regiment. The Soviets broke through our left wing. No. Now they're attacking from the right as well. Similar reports were arriving virtually simultaneously from dozens of different sectors. The officials tasked with putting together the big picture simply couldn't comprehend what was happening. Where should the armored reserve be sent? Which division was under the main attack? Which disruption posed the greatest threat? There were no clear answers. With each passing hour, new messages reported that another sector had been breached. Meanwhile, on the front line, the Soviet infantry demonstrated experience gained after years of extremely bloody fighting. Small groups advanced, protected by tanks. Sapper teams rushed ahead, removing mines and clearing paths through German minefields. Soviet machine guns quickly established positions to cover the advance of their comrades. Whenever they encountered organized resistance, the supporting artillery would go into action, Cannons positioned a few kilometers behind fired rapidly at any German position that still posed a threat. Within minutes, new bombardments destroyed machine guns, anti-tank guns, or small groups of soldiers attempting to reorganize their defenses. It was an impressive level of coordination. Infantry, tanks, artillery, aviation. They all seemed to operate as a single, perfectly synchronized machine. Above the battlefield, Soviet fighter planes maintained constant patrols. Whenever German aircraft attempted to appear, they were immediately intercepted. The few Luftwaffe aircraft available in that region could no longer provide sufficient cover for the ground troops. The famous Il-2 attack aircraft repeatedly returned to the battlefield. They dove down on German columns that were trying to move to close the gaps. They fired. Another difficult situation, similar to so many others the Wehrmacht had experienced since the beginning of the war. Temporary encirclements had occurred before. Well-executed counterattacks frequently reopened passages. There was a feeling, however fragile, that this crisis too would be overcome. But the reality was very different. The morning after the siege was lifted, the officers began to notice a disturbing detail. No supply trucks had arrived overnight. None. The field kitchens awaited food that never arrived. The depots expected new shipments of ammunition. The workshops awaited parts to repair damaged vehicles. The makeshift hospitals desperately needed medicine, plasma, and surgical instruments. Nothing arrived. The roads that had fed that battlefront for years now belonged to the Red Army. Inside the pocket, all that existed was what was already stored there, and nobody knew how long that would be enough. The quartermaster officers immediately began taking stock of available supplies. The conclusion was worrying. There was enough ammunition to sustain intense fighting for only a few days. In some units, the reserves were even smaller. Certain battalions possessed less than half the amount of projectiles considered necessary for a single defensive battle. The fuel situation was equally critical. Tanks that were still operational began receiving orders to conserve every liter of diesel or gasoline. Many vehicles stopped circulating altogether. Trucks remained parked because there wasn't enough fuel to keep them running. Some commanders decided to use horse-drawn carts to transport ammunition and wounded soldiers, a scene more reminiscent of the battlefields of the First World War than a mechanized war. Food reserves also began to dwindle rapidly. In the early days, the kitchens were still able to distribute relatively complete meals. Hot soups, dark bread, some canned goods, and small portions of meat still reached the soldiers. But then came the cuts. The portions have been reduced, then reduced again. In just a few days, many men received only a small piece of stale bread and a ladle of extremely thin soup for the entire day. Hunger was beginning to appear, and with her came another equally dangerous enemy, tiredness. Exhausted soldiers had to remain in the trenches for hours with virtually no sleep. Soviet attacks occurred during the day and often continued into the night. There were always enemy patrols trying to locate weak points in the defense. There was always artillery firing. There were always planes flying overhead. Rest was becoming a luxury. Many men stayed awake for more than 20 or 30 hours at a time. Some simply fell asleep sitting in the trenches, clutching their rifles. Others slept for only a few minutes between bombings, only to be awakened again by the explosions. Meanwhile, on the Soviet side, the siege was becoming increasingly tight. New divisions kept arriving to reinforce the ring around the pocket. Cannons were positioned in virtually every sector. Whenever observers identified any concentration of German troops, it only took a few minutes for a hail of projectiles to fall precisely on that spot. Soviet artillery seemed to be everywhere at once, in the morning, the afternoon, during the night. There were no predictable schedules. The objective was not merely to destroy defensive positions. It was to prevent any sense of security. It was to physically and psychologically exhaust the men trapped inside the pocket. The explosions have become part of the routine. Many soldiers no longer reacted to the initial impact. They continued digging trenches or carrying ammunition boxes while projectiles exploded nearby. The body was beginning to get used to the danger, but not the mind. The psychological strain was enormous. With each new bombing, the same question arose. Will they attack this time? In many sectors, nerves were completely frayed. All it took was a branch breaking in the middle of the night for several soldiers to fire simultaneously into the darkness. The constant tension made any noise seem like a threat. Military doctors observed a growing number of men unable to continue fighting. Some were trembling uncontrollably. Others remained completely silent, staring blankly into space. There were soldiers who simply stopped responding when called by name. They had no visible injuries, but their minds had reached their limit. Meanwhile, the makeshift hospitals were becoming scenes of constant suffering. Schools, churches, barns, and basements began to serve as infirmaries. The hallways were completely packed. Doctors worked practically without rest. There was a shortage of anesthetics. There was a shortage of antibiotics. Surgical instruments were lacking. Many amputations. Military engineers had dug kilometers of trenches, laid minefields, and constructed positions for machine guns and artillery. Many soldiers believed that if the Red Army attempted an attack there, it would pay a very high price for every meter gained. The powerful person responsible for defending that sector was Army Group North of Ukraine, commanded by Field Marshal Walter Model until the end of June, and then by Joseph Haab. It was one of the most important formations of the Wehrmacht at that time. Its divisions occupied positions around Lviv, Brody, and other strategic cities, forming a barrier between the Soviet advance and the borders of occupied Poland. Lviv was not just an important city on the map. It was one of the largest logistical centers in the region. Supplies, ammunition, fuel, and reinforcements destined for German troops scattered along the Eastern Front passed through its roads and railways. Whoever controlled Lviv would control one of the main transport corridors between Ukraine, Poland, and the Carpathians. Losing this city would mean opening a dangerous door for the Soviet advance towards the center of Europe. To the south, the Carpathian Mountains also had enormous strategic value. Those mountains protected crucial access routes to Hungary and Slovakia, important allies of Germany. If the Red Army broke through that line, it could directly threaten industrial regions vital to the German war effort and cut off important supply routes. Therefore, German commanders observed their maps believing they possessed a privileged position. Many officers concluded that the Soviets, after the gigantic effort of Operation Barrage, would need weeks, perhaps months, to reorganize their forces before launching a new large-scale offensive. This assessment seemed logical. After all, moving hundreds of thousands of men, thousands of tanks, artillery pieces, and trucks required a gigantic logistical operation. But there was a fatal problem. They were analyzing the enemy based on the limitations that the German army itself faced. The Red Army of 1944 was already completely different from the one that had fought in 1941. Its mobilization capacity, industrial production, and coordination between infantry, armor, artillery, and aviation had reached an impressive level. While many German generals believed they were buying time, on the other side of the front line, a new storm was silently brewing. In the German positions, the routine continued almost normally. Soldiers reinforced trenches, cleaned their weapons, distributed ammunition, and calmly observed the horizon through binoculars. Trucks still traveled the roads carrying supplies. Officers discussed maps in underground command posts illuminated by dim lamps. Although everyone knew that a new battle was coming, few imagined its true scale. Among many commanders, a dangerous sense of overconfidence prevailed. They believed their fortifications would hold, that their veteran divisions could withstand any attack, and that the Red Army would eventually wear itself down against their defensive lines. It was a confidence built on maps, incomplete reports, and optimistic expectations, not on the reality unfolding on the other side of the front. Meanwhile, beyond the reach of German observers, thousands of cannons were discreetly positioned. Endless columns of tanks moved through the night to avoid aerial reconnaissance. Ammunition depots were relentlessly replenished. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers silently awaited the order to advance. The Germans still believed they were in control of the situation. In truth, they were merely living through the last days of calm before one of the most devastating offensives of the entire Second World War fell upon Army Group North Ukraine. What seemed like a solid and well-protected front would soon be engulfed by an avalanche of fire attacked by Soviet aircraft. The Luftwaffe could no longer protect them. The skies belonged to the Red Army. With the fall of Lviv and the destruction of the Brody pocket, the entire German defensive structure in the southern part of the Eastern Front collapsed. The Soviets quickly reached the Vistula River and established important bridgeheads in Polish territory. Germany was losing not only men and equipment. I was wasting my time. It was losing ground. He was losing initiative. It was losing the ability to prevent the war from reaching its own borders. For thousands of German soldiers who survived that campaign, the Lviv disaster represented the moment they understood that the war could no longer be won. There would still be bloody battles. There would still be months of desperate resistance. There would still be destroyed cities and thousands dead. But something had changed irreversibly. The Wehrmacht was no longer in control of events. Now it was merely reacting to the continued advance of the Red Army. The Lvov-Sandomierz offensive was not just another Soviet victory. It destroyed one of Germany's main military formations, eliminated tens of thousands of experienced soldiers, definitively broke through the defenses of Western Ukraine, and opened a strategic corridor that would lead the Red Army to Poland, and a few months later, ever closer to Berlin. The Brody disaster and the fall of Lvov showed the world that the German war machine, which years before had conquered half of Europe with astonishing speed, was now being consumed by the very war it believed it controlled. On roads covered in debris, among burned tanks, dead horses, and cities reduced to ruins, the legacy of that offensive remained. Tens of thousands of lives lost, families destroyed, and a decisive chapter of the Second World War. The Lviv catastrophe marked the beginning of the end for Army Group North Ukraine, and definitively brought the Red Army closer to the final march that would end, less than a year later, in the heart of the Third Reich, on the ruins of Berlin. had to be performed with extremely limited resources. Seriously injured people waited hours, sometimes days, to receive treatment. The smell of blood mingled with that of gunpowder, smoke, and medicine. Flies covered the bandages. The summer heat accelerated the decomposition of bodies that often remained near combat positions, because there were simply no conditions to bury them immediately. Diseases began to appear. Clean water was becoming increasingly difficult to find. The wells had been destroyed by the bombings. Nearby streams were frequently under observation by Soviet artillery. Searching for water meant risking one's own life. In some units, soldiers have even resorted to rationing the amount of water intended for hygiene. Thirst was becoming as worrying as hunger. The horses were also beginning to suffer. Thousands of them were still being used to pull carts, transport artillery, and move supplies. Without enough food, many animals simply collapsed from exhaustion. Others died after being hit by the bombings. Their carcasses remained scattered along the roads, increasing the stench that already dominated much of the area. As the days passed, a subtle change became noticeable among the soldiers. The conversations began to dwindle. At the beginning of the siege, there were still jokes, small attempts to raise morale, or discussions about when reinforcements would arrive. Now, silence prevailed. Each man made his own calculations. How many cartridges were left? How long would the food last? Would the relief troops actually come? Or had they all been abandoned? The answers never came. Even so, the High Command continued sending messages encouraging resistance. It was promised that armored forces would break through the siege. It was promised that the Luftwaffe would drop supplies. The promise was that all they had to do was resist a little longer. Some believed it. Others could no longer hide their pessimism. The truth was cruel. Outside the pocket, the Soviets were strengthening their positions by the hour. Each new artillery battery installed. Every new infantry regiment arrives. Every new minefield built. All of this made a future escape even more difficult. Ivan Konev understood perfectly that time was now working in favor of the Red Army. He didn't need to launch desperate attacks. All that was needed was to slowly tighten the noose. Consume the German ammunition. Eat your food. Consume your hope. It was a cold, calculated, and extremely efficient method. Inside the pocket, however, many officers finally understood what they had refused to accept for days. They were no longer defending a strategic position. They were prisoners, and if no drastic decision was made quickly, tens of thousands of men would end up dying there without ever seeing their families again. Faced with this reality, desperate proposals began to emerge. There was only one option left: breakthrough, the siege by force. Even if it meant throwing thousands of hungry, exhausted men with little ammunition against a numerically superior enemy. It was an almost suicidal gamble, but remaining still meant an even more certain death. As the days passed, it became impossible to hide the reality. Brody's pocket was doomed. The promises that large armored forces would break through the encirclement never materialized. The Luftwaffe, which at other times in the war had managed to supply surrounded troops by air, no longer possessed enough aircraft or control of the skies to repeat operations of that scale. The few transports that attempted to approach faced Soviet fighters and a powerful curtain of anti-aircraft fire. Only a negligible amount of supplies managed to reach the men trapped inside the pocket. Each passing day further diminished their chances of survival. We were running out of ammunition. The food supply had practically run out. The units no longer fought as organized divisions, but as small groups trying to survive. Even so, the order remained the same: resist. However, the German commanders themselves realized that continuing to wait meant only watching the complete destruction of their troops. Only one alternative remained: to gather all those still capable of fighting and try to break through the encirclement before the Red Army tightened the ring even further. The decision has been made. The attack would take place during the night. The darkness offered the only possible advantage. Without daylight, Soviet planes would have difficulty locating the German columns, and perhaps a small opportunity to break through enemy lines would arise. As soon as the sun began to disappear on the horizon, thousands of soldiers silently left their positions. The wounded who were still able to walk joined the columns. Fuel tanks with little fuel were placed at the front. The last available armored vehicles received all the remaining gasoline. Light cannons were prepared to accompany the infantry. All of that represented the last hope for tens of thousands of men. For several kilometers, the march proceeded in relative silence. Nobody spoke. All that could be heard was the sound of boots sinking into the damp earth, the creaking of cart wheels, and the muffled roar of the engines of the few armored vehicles still in operation. But the Soviets were waiting. Reconnaissance patrols had observed unusual movements throughout the day. Captured prisoners also revealed that an escape attempt was likely to happen. As the first German columns approached the Soviet lines, flares completely illuminated the darkness. In a few seconds, night turned into day. Next came hell. Hundreds of cannons opened fire simultaneously. Machine guns began firing in all directions. Mortars hurled bombs at the compact columns of soldiers. Soviet tanks emerged from the smoke, blocking the few available corridors. The escape attempt immediately turned into a massacre. The German columns squeezed into narrow paths between fields and small wooded areas. He would immediately dive down on it. Rockets were hitting trucks loaded with fuel. Machine guns swept through soldiers trying to flee to the ditches. Successive explosions transformed kilometers of road into veritable steel graveyards. The smoke could be seen dozens of kilometers away. Meanwhile, in the small villages of the region, residents watched the battle with a mixture of fear and disbelief. Many had lived through the German occupation since 1941. Now they saw, for the first time, the enormous German army retreating in disarray. Tanks were burning in the streets. Exhausted soldiers were asking for water. The injured were transported in makeshift carts because there were no longer enough ambulances. It was a completely different image from the powerful Wehrmacht that had invaded the Soviet Union 3 years earlier. Another problem was starting to emerge rapidly: a lack of reserves. In the early years of the war, the Germans typically maintained armored divisions ready to intervene quickly whenever a front was threatened. By July 1944, this capability had virtually disappeared. A large portion of the mobile reserves had been destroyed in Belarus during Operation Bagration. Others were deployed in different sectors of the Eastern Front, or had already been sent to fight the Allies in Normandy, following the landings that had taken place just over a month earlier. This meant that Joseph Harp, commander of Army Group North Ukraine, simply did not have enough forces to close all the breaches that were appearing. It was a desperate situation. Each division sent to contain an advance left another sector completely exposed. It was like trying to put out a gigantic fire using only a few buckets of water. The more effort he put into one spot, the more the fire spread to another. By the end of the second day of the offensive, there was no longer any doubt among many German officers. The front of the boat was broken. It was no longer a question of stopping the Soviet advance. Now the task was to avoid an even greater disaster. But time was running out quickly. While the German High Command was still debating which reserves could be moved and which positions should continue to be held at all costs, Konev's armored spearheads advanced ever deeper. Their goal was no longer just to break through the defensive line. They were converging on a specific point on the map, a city surrounded by roads, fields, and small forests, where tens of thousands of German soldiers continued fighting, unaware that the siege was slowly closing in around them. This place was called Brody. Within a few hours, the battle would cease to be a simple breach of the front. It would turn into a gigantic trap, from which few would be able to escape. As German defensive lines crumbled in various sectors of the Eastern Front, one of the most dangerous points on that gigantic battlefield began to assume decisive importance. The city of Brody located about 70 kilometers northeast of Lviv. It was rapidly becoming the center of a huge trap carefully planned by the Soviet command. At first glance, Brody seemed like just another medium-sized town surrounded by farmland, small forests, and dirt roads, but its geographical position made it an important military hub. Roads led from there to supply German troops scattered throughout the region. As long as Brody remained in the hands of the Wehrmacht, there was still some hope of reorganizing its defenses. That was precisely why Ivan Konev had chosen that sector as the central point of his maneuver. His goal wasn't to win Brody over immediately. His real plan was far more ambitious. He wanted to trap tens of thousands of German soldiers within that region and then completely close off all escape routes. It was one of the most classic maneuvers of modern warfare, the operational encirclement. While Soviet infantry maintained heavy frontal pressure on German positions, enormous armored formations advanced rapidly on both flanks. Like two gigantic doors slowly closing, the Soviet armies drew closer to each other, several kilometers behind the front line.